public access media, meaning public for the benefit of all sectors of the population, regardless of whether they are in remote areas, they are in urban inner city areas, they are uptown. It's public access, because we are not really talking anymore about the notion of service in that old sense of something being provisioned for you and content being selected for you. In fact, persons are helping themselves to gain access to the kinds of content which they require and which they will download differentially according to their needs, interests, demographic groups, etc. And media, because it's not just anymore about broadcasting. We are talking about multi-channel media access. And so that's my preferred designation for what is emerging into this second decade of the 21st century. So this kind of technology is encompassing the delivery of information, entertainment, and education to citizens at low cost, hopefully, very limited cost to the receivers, if any, and via a diversity of digital platforms. So this is the scenario of the present consumption spread. You can see that internet is emerging, internet access in the yellow, as a critical but relatively recent piece of the distribution. And towards the bottom, almost in that white invisible space, is print, flatlining, cinema being repurposed to almost a kind of boutique exposure in many jurisdictions, radio holding its own, but needing to move into the analog space in order to give more scope to the kind of content that we are talking about. And then a whole range of other things, often in the mix of the other providers globally, including games as part of public media access provisioning, because we are talking about provisioning also for the younger segments of the population who may wish to learn social messages through games and through other such applications. So that provides us with that kind of spread. We have now the digital platforms that people can pull content from. And where we are talking about the variation of these kinds of imported technologies is where we are talking about making them, to the extent possible, appropriate technologies, or at a minimum making sure that the content we traffic through that kind of technology is appropriate to our cultural environment and also to the different segments of the population that we are talking about. We often have a pretty lengthy discussion about where technology is going globally, and we have a number of persons who have contributed to that discussion. It is an ongoing discussion, and I will only advert to some of those who have been making a contribution without going into any detail. Many of you will recognize the work and thinking of Marshall McLuhan, who speaks about this notion of the medium being the message, that we can transform society by the kinds of generational technology, pervasive spread of technology, and that can be even more impactful than the content itself. We know about Macomber, who speaks about technology in all its different representations, as era, as tool, as enabler, and a lot else that Macomber had to offer in relation to where we are with this notion of technology. Habermas, widely revered and celebrated, speaks about the role of information in the public sphere, that it makes a difference in terms of the kind of content that is available to people in their decision making and in their relationships with each other, with the public sector, and with the services that are delivered to the public sector. We know about Manuel Castells, who is widely known for the notion of networking and the interconnectedness of the technologies across geographical boundaries, across domains, from top to bottom and straight across. And then we also know about Neil Postman, who not only wrote the book that's called Technopoly, which is the notion that if we are not careful in how we both innovate and utilize the technology could come to control us rather than us controlling the technologies. I was just listening on the way here to BBC program on Stephen Hawkins' analysis of artificial intelligence and the dangers that he is foreseeing as part of the mix. In his notion, artificial intelligence or robotics is likely to be either the greatest human invention or the worst human invention, because it's the one that has the potential of taking over and doing things that we did not program it to do in the first place. But the notion by Neil Postman is that, to put it in Oliver Samuel's terms, we run things, things not run we, and that is really where we should be going with this technology and not just blindly adopting it. Postman makes very interesting reading, both in the book called Technopoly and in his other celebrated publication called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And that's a whole analysis on people's immersion in television, in particular, in a kind of mindless way. So these are contributors to a very important discussion about where we are going with the technologies. I cite for us there just some of the core technologies that are combining to create the apps that are part of this era. Many of those are recognizable to you, but it is in their combination that they are most effective in terms of how people are able to utilize them. In other words, we are talking about convergence, which we will hear about a little later, and the adaptation of these core technologies. For example, one such adaptation foretells the potential death, and in fact, actual death in some parts, of the set-top box in favor of apps that encourage streaming and the whole delivery of the kind of content that is excluding the necessity for your traditional cable provider. So that's part of the adaptation we are talking about. With the rise of entities like Netflix and Hulu and others, OTT technologies, we are emerging into the potential of obtaining content through means other than the traditional ways that we would receive television content. So, how will public service broadcasting services be delivered in an environment where cable companies no longer exist and exist in the form that we now know it? And from all the studies we have done in the different countries, this is not a far-fetched or a far time frame scenario. What we are talking about is what they have often said is the cutting of the cord. Many public service broadcasters, including the BBC, would already be ahead of that curve in terms of implementation of other ways in which the content can be streamed and provided, that public access media distribution. In the case of BBC, we see the iPlayer, which works not only on videographic, visual content, but also for radio, and part of that whole transition that we are currently seeing. So the BBC approach is a broad portfolio of internet-connected devices and websites, including BBC News, sport, weather, children's websites. The interactive services, something called BBC Red Button, providing access to content directly related to what's being watched on TV or through interactive games. So that's the BBC's approach, multiple channels, etc. The evolved PBS in the United States has a similar approach. We are looking at exemplars of where we might be or could be, but with adaptations to our own local context. So in the case of PBS, major presence in the digital space with content available on several platforms. So they have in common multiple platforms, including iPad, iPhone or phone, smartphone, Xbox, Apple, and so on. Online features, including learning media, so it's not just about entertainment, but also about education. It's not just about grown-ups, but also about children. And we place a lot of emphasis sometimes on the televisual side of PBS, but radio remains important. In fact, a lot of households now who can't afford cable are reverting to the rabbit ears, basic television, and or radio. And again, we are evolving. As you can see, that radio set again makes its appearance, but alongside some very cutting-edge Samsung types of reception technologies for audio. So then, colleagues, application of high-end technologies to push the boundaries will involve substantial funding to re-equip the public access media scenario that we are talking about. The cost of content production and sourcing must also be seen as tied up in relation to the delivery of quality technical services. The availability, for example, of animation presumes a certain quality of reception for best viewing of that kind of content. Acceptance that public access media PSB content and services in Jamaica may not be exclusively delivered by PSB branded services such as the PBCJ. Clustering the technology capabilities of such entities as JIS, CPTC, and so on could well form, or is perhaps already to some degree forming, or needs to even more form, the basis of the spread of offerings that we are talking about. So active consideration required for closer operational collaboration between those who provide similar kinds of services in the public sector. The creation, for example, of a content production and perhaps technology fund to be operated in order to help us get to part of what we're talking about, if not in the actual acquisition of the technologies, in the production of the best quality of content. This is something that the Broadcasting Commission has placed on the table before government in a way that would seek to have the benefits accrue to independent producers in relation to a kind of arm's length production fund. But equally important, indeed more important, is early adoption of digital switchover, transition from analog to digital broadcasting technologies as one of the key enablers of moving to that place where we can be pushing the boundaries. We have taken a very long time in this country to actually move that item forward. But I hope that it is an item that we are going to be able to move forward with quite quickly. Widespread deployment of Wi-Fi and high-speed broadband would be a critical part of what we're talking about. So, to conclude, you can see that we are talking about the major presence in the digital space of content available on multiple platforms, including iPad, iPhone, Xbox, etc. We are talking about making sure that we utilize the resources that are available to us in the present space. We are talking about adopting, but also adapting a lot of the global technologies for use in our kind of situation. Finally, to conclude with a word from Marshall McLuhan, once again, it may well be that the message, more than anything else, is in the medium. Thank you.